Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thanks to everyone for taking some time today to join Real Story Group for a 30-minute webinar on the CDP trends to watch in 2024. It's an exciting marketplace. We've been following it for over 5 years now, and the buzz just continues to grow. And so our founder, Tony Byrne, will walk us through some of the things for you to really keep an eye on that we're seeing in the marketplace as you look to maximize your CDP investments in the coming months. In terms of housekeeping, I've got a couple quick notes here to mention. First, the slides for today's presentation will be available within the next couple of days. And then for all of our subscribers on the line, you'll be able to access a recording of the presentation in your subscriber library later this week. Also want to mention there's a questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. So if you have any questions, feedback, anecdotes you'd like to share, we will have some time at the end. So please feel free to enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. I see some new faces on the line, and it's always great to have some folks that are trying us out for the first time. Welcome. For those that are new to Real Story Group, we're an analyst firm, and we've been at this for over 23 years now, and we're really unique in this space. It's a model that we have yet to come across in the sense of we never work for the vendors we cover in any way, shape, or form. Okay, we're very passionate about the fact that our primary focus is to help enterprises select the technology that's going to be the right fit for what it is that you're trying to do. So you'll never hear us say, here's the best vendor, here's the worst vendor, here's a magical quadrant or a wave that'll show you what's the right solution for you to be looking at. Our goal is to help you find the one that's right for you. And so we really take a pull no punches approach in describing the strengths of the vendors, but also their weaknesses and where they might fall short for you. With that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony to walk us through the rest of today's presentation. Tony?
Thanks, Scott. I really do love this topic. CDPs have become so important, and I would say more generally, your enterprise customer data management ecosystem is now, for many large organizations, really coming into full relief. Some of you aren't necessarily liking what you're seeing, but we've also seen a lot of progress in this area. CDP is one big piece of a larger puzzle, and that has in fact stretched the whole scope of what constitutes a CDP, which is really interesting. Still happening in 2024. We'll get into that in a minute. But we do like to set a few moments to just put this all in some context. What you're looking at here is our vendor map that we've been doing for the last 15 years. And you can see that different marketplaces represent different lines on this map. And the CDP being the orange line, pretty similar to other MarTech marketplaces in as much as you have this kind of city center with big players like Adobe, Microsoft, Oracle, Salesforce, CDP, others, SAP, others. And then you have this incredible periphery of where a lot of the action, quite frankly, is going on in terms of a lot of innovation and interesting things happening in the CDP world. But let's dig a little bit deeper about what's going on in 2024. So first, we'll talk about shifting enterprise architectures. This is something that's been going on really for the last 5 years. It's going to continue over the course of the next decade. Really important to think about CDPs in that context. Then we'll briefly talk about the marketplace evolution. We see the marketplace pretty differently than we did a couple years ago. Some shifts are happening, mostly good shifts. We'll clue you in on that. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about 4 key themes, including, of course, everybody's favorite topic, AI, and then wrap up with some final takeaways that we'll have in writing there at the end. So if you don't get notes, you'll at least have those. As Scott mentioned, you'll all be getting a copy of this deck, and those of you who are subscribers will get access to the recording as well to share with your colleagues. Okay, so let's get into it. This is Real Story Group's MarTech Services Reference Models. This is a reference model. Understand we're throwing a lot at you here. You've probably seen layer cake diagrams like this before. You've got engagement channels on top, interaction delivery environments below that, and then the first color road in the middle are engagement services like customer care, loyalty, outbound marketing and messaging, web content management, all that good stuff. That's where a lot of us have been spending at least the 2010s, really beefing up there. We think the story of the 2020s is around the bottom colored set of boxes here, which is enterprise foundation services. So these are channel agnostic capabilities that you will need to apply across all your channels in an omni-channel context. And so the key thing is that these are not bound to or tightly coupled to a particular engagement service or a particular engagement channel. And the big one in the middle column here is around data, customer data activation, which is leveraging that data, customer data operations, which is managing and processing all of that data so it's usable, and then of course enterprise data intelligence. And so CDPs then fit within this framework, and they're really, the rise of CDPs is indicative of the need to be able to manage customer data in a decoupled way and leverage that data across potentially all of your different channels. So CDPs, circa 2022, I think, the core always was customer data activation, still is, but then a number of CDP vendors started adding other capabilities or arguing that you should have other capabilities in the CDP, including customer data management. In other words, to be your customer data lake as well as your customer data activation zone. To some extent, enterprise data intelligence. Some CDP vendors even added outbound messaging to their platform. And then over here on the right, we saw a lot of emphasis in adding decisioning services, including personalization and journey orchestration. Now, you could argue, that those services do or don't belong, and this is a debate that's going on. We've certainly seen a lot of diversity among our own subscriber base about what capabilities should or should not reside within a CDP. But this is the sort of overall landscape, at least as far as 2022, of the potential services that you might see within a CDP. This has changed a little bit. 2024, we tend to see outbound marketing now being deprecated. I think CDP vendors recognizing that campaigns and outbound messaging is better left to your email service provider or marketing automation platform. Still a lot of focus on customer data activation, customer data operations. But a couple changes here. You see the AI layer. So at Real Story Group, we see AI as an enterprise capability, something that you'll want to extend across all of your channels, more properly seen as a layer. Some CDP vendors are, of course, injecting AI capabilities into their platform, the way all of your other MarTech vendors are doing that. Whether you want to use the CDP capabilities, the AI capabilities in your CDP, that's another story. Now, it's interesting, what we don't see a lot of anymore are CDPs that claim to do a lot of data analytics and reporting. And that's because typically your CDPs are more of a subset of your customer data and not a full data lake. But again, that varies by CDP. Some CDPs are designed to be more of a superset of your data. And so those will have a larger story potentially around data intelligence and potentially around AI. But we'll talk about AI in a minute, but this is just to point out that the scope of CDPs is shifting and morphing a little bit as we go into the middle of the decade. This is reflected really by the way the marketplace is evolving. So this is our latest look at the CDP marketplace. Won't spend too much time on this. You can go find more about this in our research, but basically you can see a kind of a horizontal line here and a vertical line here. The horizontal line is distinguishing suite vendors from independents. In general, we caution you against the suite vendors, a lot of problems with them. I'll come back to that in a moment. But then maybe even more importantly is this vertical line that distinguishes between processing vendors on the left and vendors that focus more on leverage on the right. And so the difference there is processing vendors tend to supply a full data lake of all of your customer data, process it, help you manage it, maybe do some master data management, build that golden record, often have very heavy duty identity resolution. The ones on the right tend to be more about just getting leverage out of that data, tend to be run more by marketing ops rather than data ops. In the real world, these tend to blend. As analysts, we like to put things in neat boxes, so I'll caution you that no vendor ever fits neatly into a box, that this is more of a spectrum. But anyway, this gives you a general idea of how the landscape is breaking out. And I would argue that what's happening here, and this happens in all mature marketplaces, and it's really happening in the CDP market, really just in the last year or two, is the market emerging on a complexity spectrum, right? So you have more complex CDPs and lighter CDPs. One is generally not better than the other, but it is an important thing to understand with respect to your level of investment, your level of maturity, and where it fits into your overall architecture. All right, so that sets up the topic, and we've already kind of introduced a couple of themes around shifting scope, evolving marketplace, but now we'll take a look at 4 key themes for 2024. So first, I think what we're going to see in 2024 is what we call the reverse ETL hangover. So we've got a couple of reverse ETL vendors here in the middle of this diagram under the activation-oriented independence, high-touch, Rudderstat. You could argue there's a couple of more. And the reverse ETL vendors are saying that they can replace and should replace a full CDP. We generally tend to think that this is not true, that this is a bit of a flash in the pan. What we find when these vendors are actually selected is it's the data team who licenses them, not the marketing team. Now, there may be a place, and in fact, in a large enterprise, there almost always is a place for reverse ETL as a function, as a service, as a capability, as part of your broader data ops fabric. And hey, that's great. You know, there's uses for it. But as a replacement for a CDP, they mostly have come up short in their inability to deal effectively with real time, the way that they end up copying data all over the place to your engagement environments at just the time when you're trying to decouple data management from those environments. And so we don't think that they're CDP replacements. And we're sensing that some early adopters of them are coming up a little bit short in terms of the actual usability and marketer effectiveness of it. So we think that there's going to be a little bit of a hangover there, and we'll have more to say about that in the coming months. The other big theme that's happening here is what we would call the unresolved B2B conundrum. So CDPs were originally designed to support large-scale B2C marketing efforts. Many B2Bs have their marketing database of record, their customer database of record, either in their marketing automation platform and or their Salesforce automation platform, /CRM, and it's been a bit of a struggle for B2B vendors, for B2B companies to find a CDP that's apt for them. Some data suppliers and ABM vendors that you see over on the right claim that they have a CDP, but really it's just secondary to their real purpose, which is to sell you data or to sell you ABM services or something else. They're not really independent, full-blown B2Bs. So what that leaves is there is definitely an opening for what we would call mass market B2Bs to use B2C oriented platforms that have some sense of an account or organizational entity. It's a little bit backfilled into some of these platforms, so we're still seeing customers struggle a little bit there, but there has been some progress. But I think we still haven't really seen a definitive sort of B2B vendor leap out and get at this. The other thing, as many of you know, has dropped just in the last week or so in the CDP marketplace was an exceptionally ridiculous Gartner Magic Quadrant. Of course, when I say ridiculous Magic Quadrant, I'm kind of being a little bit redundant there, but they had Salesforce, Telium, Treasure Data, and Adobe in the top right. We recently posted on LinkedIn what we think about this, but if you were going to ask me who are 3 of the least loved CDPs by customers, I would say Adobe, Salesforce, and Telium. And so you need to be very careful about this. Treasure Data is an interesting CDP. It's either going to be, it's a very opinionated CDP. It's either going to be a great fit for you or a really bad fit for you. So, you know, on the one hand, the critique here is that Magic Quadrants are ridiculous because they're not contextual. They don't describe what's going to be the best fit for you. But this one is particularly ridiculous because of the leaders who have very problematic CDPs right now. And so what's interesting about Telium, Salesforce, and Adobe is that they tend not to sell their CDPs because they did an actual empirical test-based competitive selection process. they tend to just sell by cross-selling you, saying, okay, you already have these other Telium, Adobe, Salesforce, now just lump on our CDP, you know, like a roof rack on your SUV. And that's not the way you should buy a CDP. And that's the only way that these guys get bought. And of course, they've snowed Gartner, but they don't need to snow you. So you can expect probably some executives who believe this stuff may be saying, why didn't we get Salesforce? Why didn't we get Telium? Why didn't we get Adobe? Feel free to send them our way. The fourth theme is around AI and what's the proper role for AI within a CDP. And so on the one hand, we definitely caution you that you should be careful about AI capabilities that are injected into any MarTech platform, because you don't know about the provenance, the cost, the guardrails, all this other stuff, and that you ought to be dealing ideally with AI at a more enterprise level, which among our council members, we find that those who actually have an enterprise AI strategy, that kind of frees up their marketing team to be much more creative and pursue lower cost pilots. So a lot of really interesting stories there that you can check out in our research. But the ideal place with AI is a place that most of us haven't gotten to, which is really beyond the pilots. So a lot of pilots have been really interesting, but difficult to scale, difficult sometimes to replicate. Ideally, you'd have a flywheel here where you uncover a potential opportunity, figure out what to do with that opportunity using decisioning. You create all of the different content variants that are required using generative, and then you go through this actual program as opposed to a project where you're flywheeling and getting better and better and more automated. That's, I think, where we all want to get to. We're not there yet. It requires a lot of integration. But with respect to AI, with respect to CDPs, you're probably not going to see your CDP help you with a lot of insights AI. And this comes as a surprise because your CDP vendor, of course, probably is going to show you some sexy modeling interface where you can do some predictive modeling. But you have to remember that if your CDP is not riding on top of a comprehensive data lake of all of your customer data, their models are likely to be pretty weak. Now, they may be better if you don't have any right now, but long-term, you're probably going to want to have real data scientists building robust models off a superset of all of your customer data. And the real story around AI within your CDP is probably going to be more on the decisioning side, where you can quickly build and adapt algorithms around what you actually do with the opportunities that get exposed. And so we're not seeing that necessarily a lot today within CDPs. That's probably where this all is headed. In the meantime, if you see your CDP being able to do some AI modeling for you, at this point, we're going to likely call most of that just demo candy right now. Okay, so wanted to remind you that we will have time for your questions, your comments, things you disagree with, any observations. But in the meantime, so feel free to use the questions tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. But in the meantime, let's just wrap up with some final takeaways. So we know that many of you are coming to this conversation because you're looking to select either a replacement CDP, yes, we are seeing some, or you're looking to buy a new CDP. We wrote the book on this particular topic, and we're going to suggest that you dispense with traditional waterfall means of doing this and instead take a more agile design thinking approach that's business focused, team-based, definitely empirical, talk about that in a second, and adaptive. You're not going to get your requirements perfect, particularly if this is your first CDP, through your traditional requirements gathering exercises. So you need a more iterative process for your requirements to unfold. We're involved in a CDP bake-off right this week where some really interesting requirements emerged during the bake-off that none of us caught during the RFP phase or the demo phase. So you definitely want to have a bake-off. I'll talk about that in a second. Understand that CDPs can support a number of different business use cases. There's at least 10 categories that we use when we're evaluating the CDP vendor. So Real Story Group evaluates 30 CDP vendors head to head, and we do it against these use case archetypes. The important thing for you is to understand which 2 or 3 of these are going to have the highest business impact for you, because a typical vendor only excels at 2 or 3 of these, kind of has a story around 2 or 3 more, and often with very good reason doesn't touch the other 3 to 4, right? So it's really important as always, to really get your business objectives aligned with what you're trying to do, and that's why static quadrants are so ridiculous. Now, you've probably seen in design thinking that you follow a path of empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. We apply that model whenever we're helping an organization pick a CDP. First, you create your diverse user stories, building off those and personalizing those or adapting those archetypes that I listed on the previous page. Then you go through a definitional phase where you might create an RFP or a request for demo and a vendor shortlist, maybe 48 vendors. You ideate, which is a really interactive way of reviewing proposals and demos. Their demos are not generic demos, they're actually demoing your user stories. But now the most important thing I wanted to talk about was the prototyping phase. As I mentioned, we're in the midst of a bake-off just this week with a client. This is hands-on with real scenarios. Now, you may need to do dummy data, but you can always have the vendor create a repository with 6, 20, 100 million dummy records according to a data model that you give them. You have your people actually test it out. Doesn't need to take any more than 3 to 5 days. You want to do this competitively with 2 vendors. That's when you'll find out really what the CDP wants to do easily and what it doesn't want to do easily. And that's where you'll confirm what your real requirements are going into an MVP. You can always test a single finalist, including critical integration testing, maybe using live actual data during a POC that you'll want to then do in parallel with your contract negotiations. I can tell you that our experience with contract negotiations with CDP vendors have been unusually long and contentious. So forewarned is forearmed here. All right, so let's talk about the final takeaways then. The CDP market is turning into a complexity spectrum. That's because it's maturing. And that's a good thing for you because some of you are going to need more or less complex tools. The major MarTech suite vendors, including Adobe, Oracle, Microsoft, and especially Salesforce, still lag in this market for a variety of different reasons. So you want to push back against some of the BS that you'll get both from the vendors themselves and from analyst firms. This fad of reverse ETL as CDP will likely fade. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't invest in reverse ETL vendors' capabilities. You may need those capabilities, but don't imagine that that's going to swap in for a CDP, because I'm going to say 95% of the time it's not. There's still issues around B2B that remain unresolved. If you are a B2B firm, check in with us. We have more to say about this. We're starting to see some differentiation among CDP vendors on decisioning services. This is testing, optimization, personalization, and journey orchestration across channels. But other factors may matter more, including performance, architecture, usability is still a big issue. The way that you can build segments, the way that you can ingest and adapt streaming data. These are all things that vendors differ on. AI for CDP is likely going to be more about decisioning rather than modeling. So when you see the nifty, cute little modeling AI within your CDP vendor, note that you'll probably get that capability better from somewhere else. And you want to be aware of AI silos via vendor click grab. So this is more of an issue with generative, but just this concept that, you know, if they're embedding somebody else's AI, you want to know about that. And then finally, always, always, always for any MarTech, but especially something complicated like CDPs, take a design thinking approach when you're doing vendor evaluation and vendor selection. Don't use traditional waterfall model. That's where you get back into bad choices, and we can certainly help you with that. Speaking of helping you, there's 3 ways that Real Story Group has been helping enterprises for the last 2 decades. One is you can license any one of our streams, any one of these colored lines here, get the inside dope on all the different vendors, not just what they do well, but what they do very poorly. Some large enterprises pick the second option here, which is to have us help them optimize their stack. In other words, they license all of our research, full stack subscription, and we help them think through the future of their stack. Subset of those groups then learn from their peers by joining our exclusive customer-only MarTech Council, which meets offline and online. We'll be meeting in Amsterdam next in June later this year, and then in Silicon Valley in California in October. Really great private conversations where we have a lot of structured peer-to-peer sharing. So if you're interested in that, you can talk to my colleague Scott. And speaking of Scott, he's going to tell you about next steps while I take a quick look at the questions that you have been asking us here. So Scott, what are the next steps?
Absolutely. Thanks, Tony. And there are a number of questions that have come in, so I'll be very brief, but please feel free to reach out with any additional questions, or if you'd like to see a demonstration of what the subscriber experience would look like if you chose to leverage RSG's research on CDPs or any other areas that are mentioned here. I do want to also plug our next webinar, which will be at this time next Wednesday. We're going to take a look at the future of journey orchestration in an AI world. So we'll look at the vendor landscape and some of the potential pitfalls that we've been seeing. So please join us for that if you'd like. And Tony, I see several questions have come into the queue since we've been chatting here.
Yeah, so Jason's asking, curious about where Zeta, so Zeta is another MarTech vendor, would fall in the Circa 2024 groupings. We're having some conversations with Zeta. Zeta is one of those kind of vendors. There's a lot of these that want to be your kind of your full MarTech stack, which is they've got email, they've got personalization, they've got CDP, they've got a number of different things. We tend to find that's more of a mid-market play, but check back with us in several months. David is asking, noting your comments about CDPs for B2B companies, what do you recommend in terms of how best to approach a decision for the right CDP for B2Bs? Well, I think, unfortunately, you're at a situation where you are going to have to figure out what sort of compromises you may or may have to make. And a lot of it really comes down to the types of segments that you want to build. And can some of the sometimes crude organizational models in some CDPs work for you? The other alternative is to go way up market into some of the more complicated processing-oriented CDPs that have more object-oriented data models. The problem is that for most B2B firms, that's overkill. So we can have a deeper conversation about that, David, at another time. Thomas is asking about Salesforce. Other than the fact that Salesforce struggles to find a name for their CDP, what are the biggest problems you're seeing? Yeah, so the name has changed, but I think, Thomas, that's indicative of other things going on. We're a Salesforce org, and we like the integrations we've seen of Data Cloud and Marketing Cloud. But after 18 months of working with Salesforce to reach a comfort level, now I'm doubting based on the latest opinions from RSG and others. Yeah, so there's significant issues with the Salesforce CDP. First of all, it's a collection of 3 different platforms that don't play very well together. And then among them, there's a lot of sort of daily batch-oriented processing. It's very messy. And Salesforce has not been totally honest with their clientele and with the market about what's in it. And so, you know, that always should get the hair on the back of your head up. So your reservations are well taken. Let's see, James is asking, are there any CDPs sold into the MarTech stack that are also good in measuring or collecting data from ad tech stacks so you can really get a full model of the customer? So this isn't necessarily going to be a differentiator for a CDP. So CDP should be able to take in whatever data you want to give it. And so the interesting thing is about collecting data from ad tech stacks, you probably know, James, is a complicated issue because the ad networks don't always make it easy to get nice structured data out of it and then for you to aggregate that data in a way. But we've definitely seen CDPs leverage this. We'd say this is probably a good thought about a 5th trend that we see in CDPs is where they are helping organizations have more integrated campaigns between paid media and owned and operated. A CDP is kind of uniquely suited to do that. So your colleagues are definitely ingesting at least at a crude level, some ad data, and then leveraging off that in terms of campaigns and orchestrations. Thomas is asking, how important is real time, and can you demystify it? What use cases does it really matter? I've had several CDPs vendors go on the attack about other vendors not being real time. That's such a great question, Thomas. So there's a couple of separate issues here. So real time usually does mean near real time, and so for many real time use cases, the sort of micro batching, regular micro batching can work really well for things like abandoned cart, where you're already going to put a timer on it. So that's a great point. The real issue that's underneath this, Thomas, is whether the CDP has a proper event processing subsystem, and not all of them do, and some of them they have one, but it's crude. And that's really the issue, is that to what extent do you want to or need to use your CDP to trigger off of particular events? and do something in real time or near real time against that. Thomas is also asking about Medallia MXO, which is the former Thunderhead. We evaluate that in our journey orchestration stream. So that was the purple line or the magenta line on our subway map. Kartik is asking, could you give clarity on these vendor get the data into them? Is it tag cookie or purely server-side support? So different vendors will collect whatever data you want to give. So, you know, typically you're pumping data in from a data lake, a data warehouse, your broader customer data fabric. You may be streaming in event data, and the CDP itself typically has some sort of collection agent that you can also use to gather event data. So the CDP is getting data from a variety of different places. The key thing there is really making sure that you've got the architecture down about what you want to get from where, and then how all that comes together in the CDP is definitely a differentiator. Alex is asking, should the orchestration platforms you have inform the selection of the CDP? I'm going to say no, Alex. I think that that's the tail wagging the dog in most cases. And that CDP has to feed a number of different mouths, not just your orchestration platform, although your orchestration platform is an important downstream constituent. If you have an incumbent orchestration platform, you know, ideally you'd pick a CDP that integrates nicely with it, but the CDP really is going to be an independent layer in your stack, and you ought to select it accordingly. So that was a lot of great questions. Thanks for joining us today, folks. Glad that you stuck around as we went a little bit late. Always welcome these conversations. Feel free to reach out to us at any of the coordinates you see on the screen here if you've got further questions, and really look forward to an opportunity to help you make some difficult but highly impactful decisions around CDPs in 2024. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne and the rest of the RSG crew signing out for now. See you next time.